explorers of the liminal and the weird, and welcome to another video by Liminal Spaces. I finished Haruki Murakami's The City and Its Uncertain Walls near the end of 2024, but unfortunately, I guess not unfortunately, I went up to visit my brother in Colorado and took a break, didn't record any videos over that time, had a wonderful time, but it meant I had to put off this video till 2025, but yeah, I'd like to do a deep reading of this novel. I've already expressed a chunk of my thoughts in the review video I did for this. If you haven't seen that, go back and give that a watch. But for now, let's dive deep into this novel. Now, this was originally written as a novella in 1980 when Haruki Murakami's career was just getting started. And he really flushed out this novel from that novella. Unfortunately, that novella is impossible to find, so I haven't been able to read it. I would love to, just to see the differences between these two, but I'm unable to find it. So how much of this is new and how much of this is based on the old novel is anybody's guess for now. It is also important that I note, and I know I've talked about this a lot on this channel, but for people that are just watching this video without knowing my regular content, this original novella that this story is a rewrite of also inspired a part of Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. It's basically the End of the World portion comes from that original 1980 novella. So the End of the World portions have been very expanded in Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, and they are very similar in this book. And I'm just going to say one more time, if you are coming to this video without having read this book and you're wondering if you should read it, you should read it, but I will say you absolutely should read Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World first. And then, after you've become a little bit more familiar with Murakami, grab this one. Okay. So the beginning of this novel is about a young man who is discovering love for the first time. He's met a young woman and they have fallen in love. I think they met at some academic convention. I can't remember exactly what it is, but they live in different towns, so they write letters to each other a lot. And after a while of communicating, she tells the young man that she doesn't feel like a complete person, that she remembers a long time ago when she was very young that she used to live in a town with a wall that surrounded it, and in this town people were separated from their shadows, and she feels like she is the shadow of the real her, that the real her is still in that town and that she is a shadow version of herself. One of the things that I've said about this novel that I really think is true is that it's interesting if you're a Murakami fan and have read through most of his bibliography. This seems like a really interesting, almost greatest hits of Murakami book, in that parts of it, I mean, everybody knows Murakami has certain obsessions that he goes over again and again. This is so true that you can look on the internet for Murakami bingo and find these bingo cards that you can look at while you're reading a book, and every time a certain trope that Murakami loves comes up, you can mark that off on the card. And this, to me, seems like it is almost him bidding farewell to all that, saying all the final things he wants to say about all of these tropes that have obsessed him in his novels for so long. And this first part, number one, is very sentimental. It is obviously a man at the twilight years of his life, looking back to the early years of his life, and specifically at the concept of first love, which reminds me a lot, of course, of Norwegian Wood. And this is my Alfred Birnbaum translation. I prefer Birnbaum's translation of Norwegian Wood. So yeah, when I first started reading this, I absolutely felt like we were getting a return to style of Norwegian Wood, a reinterpretation of a lot of the love story in Norwegian Wood. But then after the town is mentioned, we suddenly get this story of a man in his mid to late 30s that is walking and falls in a hole and then is suddenly in another world. He comes out of a hole where the gatekeeper to this town keeps all the beasts, throws all the dead beasts, the dead unicorns, when they die. So this is a town with walls and unicorns and a clock tower that never tells the time. And it is the town that these two young lovers created, and the 35-year-old man is the young man who was in love with this woman. And the book at the beginning part, she talks about the fact that she absolutely remembers living in this town, and she really does feel like just a shadow of herself. But the book also talks about the fact that they kind of create this town together. It is kind of the labor of their love that they talk about, discuss, fill out the details of this town. So it's interesting that he later gets stuck in this town. But right away, I just want to say that, in my opinion, Murakami is really powerful and talented at creating analogy and metaphor. And I think that the way this young woman speaks about how she doesn't feel like a complete person can be seen as an analogy or a metaphor for what it's like to be a teenager trying to look into the future and wonder what you're going to be. But also, you could consider like this space between adulthood and childhood as kind of a liminal space. And I think I've talked once or twice about the concept of cultural liminality, or times in life where there are major events that create liminality. The one that's studied most, I think, in stuff like sociology is, of course, the area of pregnancy. And there were many cultures that felt like this was a time either that a woman needed to be very protected, or that a woman was very magical, or that the veil between the kind of spiritual world and the mundane world was very thin during pregnancy. And it's because it's a very liminal time. It's a time where somebody is a woman on one end of it, and then a mother on the other end. And this happens also with coming of age. There's so many cultures that have rituals for coming of age that's kind of a liminal space as well. But we could just look at the concept of being between adulthood and childhood as kind of a liminal space, and the concept that this woman expresses, that she feels like she's not a complete person, that the childhood version of herself that is in this town with the uncertain walls is the real version of herself. The childhood is the real version of herself, and that the adult looking forward to kind of what she's become, or what she's going to become, seems like not the real part of her, if that makes any sense. I really liked that, and to me it kind of showed that Murakami is firing on all cylinders, although I don't know if this was the idea from 1980 or if this is the one that he added in this book. But either way, I think it's a wonderful, wonderful concept that he presents here, with her expressing how chaotic it is to be a teenager, and using this concept of her childhood locked away behind these walls, and her slowly trying to navigate school and coming into her adult self, which we'll get into a bit, because he covers that in this book as well. But anyway, Very Norwegian Wood at the beginning. That is a book about a man looking back at a past relationship and his first love, and I feel that it's very similar here. So, simultaneously, while we're getting this story of their young love, which very interestingly is in the second person. Murakami hasn't done a lot of second person. I don't know what second person looks like in Japanese, but it's translated here in second person by Philip Gabriel. We simultaneously get the story of this man in the town that he had created with this woman, his first love, when he was younger. And it follows a lot of what we are familiar with from Hard-Boiled Wonderland. So I took to calling the first part of this novel Norwegian Wood and the End of the World, because that's really what it seemed like to me, a mixture of these two older books put together. The End of the World in this case, The Town with Its Uncertain Walls, is way less developed than it is in Hard-Boiled Wonderland and The End of the World. The End of the World gets a lot more page time in Hard-Boiled Wonderland and The End of the World than it does in this novel. In this novel, we're just told that his eyes are scarred and that his shadow has to be cut off. And we get the story, of course, of him with the librarian. And the librarian is, and this older man, this 35-year-old, knows that this 17-year-old that's running the librarian is his first love. But she is never met him because she's the real version of his first love, not the shadow version that was in the real world. But she helps him do his job, which is to read dreams. And dreams are just these weird egg-shaped, colorful things that he has to release stuff from. It just flows through him. He's not able to understand it or interpret it or anything like that. And he is constantly plagued with the concept that he might not be doing very well as a dream reader, and it really bothers him. And she's constantly giving him encouragement that he's doing all right. I was surprised by how fast the end of the world section in this book went. It's really, truly is just bookends for the main story of this book. I was a little bit afraid that it would be like completely rereading the End of the World portion of Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, and it's not. He covers everything that is covered in End of the World, but he does it in 127 pages. Like this much. And that's just half of this, because the other half is him talking about his love with the girl. So it's half of that, and then the end, part 3, is this long. This little part right here. So the main middle of this has nothing to do with the End of the World. So don't worry that you're going to just have to read this and basically be rereading Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, because you're not. It's a completely different story. Before I wrap up part 1, there's a couple of parts I want to point out that I thought were really interesting. Murakami always has interesting female characters, and they're interesting in the sense that they are very mysterious. And this could just be that to Murakami himself, women seem mysterious. But I think it's more than that. And I think that in this case, and in many cases in Murakami's works, his females are well developed. Even if strange shit goes on, they are well developed. And in Murakami's case, strange shit does go on. But that being said, the fact that they're well developed, they're also always viewed from the eyes of one of Murakami's main characters, which I always have a tendency to assume is Murakami himself. And that's not the most fair assumption, and I usually don't like to do that. But in Murakami's case, they're always, his main characters are always so, or his narrators are always so similar. And they always seem to be coming from the exact same place. And I feel like the place of origin is Murakami. And I honestly, that doesn't bother me, although it has bothered some people. So The women in his novels are viewed as a mystery, but he always gives them unique voices and unique actions. And some of them may just be kind of male fantasy. I think that has happened throughout his long career. And of course, he was writing in times that had completely different ideologies. But for instance, in this case, his love interest at one point, and of course, the Murakami is accurately depicting how interested in sexual relations with this woman he is. And the woman at one point says, "I had a dream about you." And my instant thought was, oh, we're going to start introducing the concept of sex into this story. But her dream is complex and weird, and she's in a bathtub and she's suddenly pregnant. And then she gets out of the water because somebody comes into the room and it's this giant man, but she can't see him because the light is shining behind him. So he's backlit and she can't see his form. And then suddenly she has eyes in the palms of her hands. And it's just wild. And then she says, "Oh, and then you showed up, but you were kind of a bit character in my dream." And he never ever finds out what his part was in that dream. And that's Murakami. He'll be telling these stories that if I were to outline the plot of this, it would take me like 4 minutes. It's very simple. But Murakami drops in all of these mysteries and concepts all throughout. Another thing that occurs with him and his first girlfriend at the time is they meet. He takes the train to her town, and he goes and he meets her at the park, and she sits stiff and almost angry looking, and he's going through his brain like, is she angry at me? Did I do something? And then she takes this walk with him, and it's like a 2-hour walk, and they don't speak the whole time. And then she sits back down with him on the same bench that they got up from before the walk and lays her head on his shoulder. And later, when she talks about it to him, she says, "Sometimes my heart gets cold and hard, and I can't go to school, and I can't eat." And I find this to be another really incredible look at the kind of emotional power that being in that space between childhood and adulthood gives a person. The extremes of emotion. I know whenever I deal with my daughter, I try to constantly remember what it was like to me to be 15 to 19, just angry at the world, confused, but also in awe of the fact of living, and the ability to change and do anything. Those different, those differences running around through our bodies, it's really wild, and I think well expressed in this. So I do like this character, and this character turns out to be probably one of the least important characters in the novel, because she's in it for such a short amount of time, just those part 1 and part 3 that I showed. But of course, also very important to this guy who is looking back at her through the years. And it's interesting because the book is, I think, him in his mid-40s eventually, looking back at this time. Written by Murakami, who's in his 70s, looking back. It's really interesting how time plays throughout this. The other part that I wanted to talk about is a part in the end of the world where they're in the town with the uncertain walls that is in this book that is not in Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. Just like in Hard-Boiled Wonderland, he meets an old soldier who kind of takes care of him. In this case, the old soldier tells a story. Maybe this is in Hard-Boiled. No, I really don't think it is. For some odd reason, this felt familiar as I was reading it, but maybe I'm just creating deja vu in my brain. But anyway, this old soldier talks about the fact that he is wounded in whatever war, because this is the town and its uncertain walls, which seems like a completely different world. But he's wounded, and he goes to an inn, and while he's at the inn recuperating, he sees a woman sitting on the veranda, and she is so shockingly beautiful to him that he realizes she has to be a ghost. She's too beautiful to be of his world. And he sees this woman, is just struck by her, and he sees her every night at the same time, and then he leaves the inn, and every relationship that he has, nothing comes close to the moment of staring at this ghost woman. And eventually he slowly begins to realize that he didn't actually see all of the ghost woman's face. He only saw one side of it, and he becomes obsessed with this concept and decides that he must see the rest of her face. So he goes back to the inn. It's very hard for him to do it because the country's still at war, and but he's able to pull some favors and get himself back to that inn, and he stays in the same room, and he's laying there, and at the same time she appears, and every time she appears he is frozen, just stuck staring at her as if in like a trance. But this time he breaks free from that and walks around and looks at the other side of her face. And at this point, our narrator, who is the older man in his 30s, that's gone back to, or been transported somehow to the town and its uncertain walls, says, "Did you see the other side of her face?" And he says, "I did." And he says, "What was it like?" And he said, "I have talked to mystics. I have looked through religions. I have done everything in my power to find the words to express what seeing that face meant to me." He said, "Nobody should see that. There is. You know what? Let me read it. This will be better because he says it so well. "The one thing I can say is that what was there was a scene from a world a person should never, ever lay eyes on. Yet at the same time, it's a world that everyone has inside of us. It's inside me and inside you too, and yet it's something you should never see, which is why most of us live our lives with eyes closed." This is, I think, the power of Murakami, and I think this is what divides people either against or for Murakami, are these concepts. It's almost Lovecraftian, right? You can't describe what he's trying to say because it's about something that literally can't be described. But he creates the mystery so beautiful. And if I were to just guess, I would say that this is about what is our outward appearance versus what is truly inside of us, and how different those are, and how every one of us has both good and bad, right? They say the demons and the angels inside of us, that this is a truth that you look on and can't go back from. And I might be reading too much into this, but this to me connects to, again, the concept of becoming an adult. Right? He says, never look on this kind of thing if you can help it. But of course, eventually we all realize that there's so much inside of us that is complex and confusing, and eventually we have to look on it. And perhaps the curse of that is becoming a responsible adult. That's a theme in one of his stories that I did on the channel, called The Second Bakery Attack. I don't know. I might be reading way too much into this. Okay. So the story of he and his girlfriend is she just stops writing him and disappears. So if you were playing Murakami Bingo and have a woman disappearing, you could mark that. She just disappears and he never hears from her again, but it really messes him up. And he dates women and is sexually active, but never gets married and never really has a strong relationship again. And he kind of links that to her, that he's always kind of thinking about and wondering about her, that he kind of went all in with that first love, and her disappearing really, really messes him up. The end of the world story, where so like I said, he loses her, he wonders for years, he gets a job in the publishing industry, and eventually one day is walking and he falls into a hole, and in kind of a liminal Alice in Wonderland way comes out a different hole that is in front of the town with its uncertain walls, and then he experiences the town directly and is able to interact with his girlfriend, but the real her, not the shadow her, and that starts to get kind of confusing. He's very delicate about this, and I was proud of that. There was never what I felt any behavior towards this 17-year-old girl that was problematic. Of course, the real her has lost her shadow, which he will refer to as heart or mind, using the word kokoro, I'm sure in the original Japanese, which is a complex term, and we'll get into that when we talk about the translations of Hard-Boiled Wonderland. But because of that, she doesn't have the emotions like love and all that kind of stuff. And he's just happy to see her and be in her presence. And it never really goes beyond that. But it follows kind of this same plot where his shadow is cut from him and his shadow is kept by the gatekeeper. And eventually the shadow will die without being connected to him, so the shadow asks him to draw a map of the town, which he tries to do, but the walls are always moving, which is why they're uncertain walls. Eventually he draws this map, gives it to his shadow, and they have a conversation. And I just want to read this really quick, because this is the shadow's interpretation of what this town is for this book. And of course, this is a completely different interpretation to what the town is for Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. So the shadow puts forth an interesting hypothesis that the town is actually where the shadows are, and the real world that they came from is where the real people are. So in this belief, the shadow would say that the real woman that he was in love with when he was a younger man was in the town, or was in the real world, and that her shadow was in this town with the uncertain walls. So we'll start, that's kind of what they're talking about. And this is on 101 of my copy, which I guess is the one you probably all have too. Okay, but if this is a land of shadows, why was I, the real me, allowed to enter this town, and why are you, a shadow, confined here and dying? I could understand if it were the opposite. I think that the people here don't know their shadows. They think they're real people, and that their shadows have been ripped apart from them and driven away to the world beyond the wall. But maybe it's the other way around. Maybe those driven outside the wall are the real people, and those who remain here are the shadows. That's my conjecture. I considered this, and the real people banished outside the wall are convinced they're shadows. Is that what you mean? That's right, that they exist on false memories. I kept rubbing my hands together as I tried to follow the logic, but halfway through I lost the threads. But that's just your hypothesis. That's right, my shadow admitted. It's all just a hypothesis I came up with. I can't prove it, but the more I think about it, the more convinced of it I am. I've examined every detail from every angle. Anyhow, I've got lots of time to think here. So according to your theory, what role does my dream reading at the library play? That's just an extension of the theory. I don't care, I'd like to hear it. My shadow paused for a moment, caught his breath, and then spoke. I think old dreams are like echoes of the minds left behind by real people, people who've been banished from the town in order for it to exist. Real people are driven out, but it's never completely perfect. There's always something left behind. Those remnants of the mind are gathered together and tightly locked away in special receptacles called old dreams. Echoes of the mind? While people are still young here, the body and the shadow are ripped apart, and then the body is exiled outside the wall as something superfluous, something harmful, so the shadows can live peacefully. But even if the body is banished, its influence doesn't totally disappear. The tiniest parts of the mind that can't be removed, and when he says mind, I'm sure he's translating the word kokoro, which is a kind of a mix between mind and heart. The tiniest parts of the mind that can't be removed, like seeds, remain and quietly grow inside the shadows. So the town finds them, collects them, and seals them inside special containers. Seeds of the mind? That's right, human emotions, sadness, confusion, jealousy, fear, distress, despair, doubt, hatred, bewilderment, anguish, skepticism, self-pity, and dreams and love. In this town, feelings are not just useless, but harmful, like seeds of an epidemic. Seeds of an epidemic, I said, repeating my shadow's words. Yes, that's why they're completely scraped away and sealed in airtight containers, then stored deep inside the library, and ordinary people are forbidden to go near them. So my role is to take the souls, or echoes of the heart, calm them, and eliminate them. It's not a job that shadows can do. Only real people with real emotions have empathy. But why do they have to be calmed? They're sealed away in airtight containers, content to be asleep, so you could just leave them be. You can seal them away as tightly as you'd like, but the very fact of their existence is a threat. The town might think that somehow the dreams will acquire the power to break free and escape. If that happened, the town would be destroyed. So they need someone to lessen that power and dissolve it, if but a little. If someone listens to the voices of the old dreams and dreams along with them, then maybe it will keep the dreams calm. That's probably what they're hoping for, and right now the only one who can do that is you. So he set up this concept of this world where people's shadows can live happily, but they need one real person to be a dream reader to get rid of the bits of heart and mind or soul that are left behind, and that is his job, to dream those dreams with the dreamers of the town and release them so the shadows can live without emotions or be bothered by any of that. Why? Who knows? In Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, he comes up with a great explanation of what exactly this town is. And that's why this sticks out as my favorite Murakami book, because usually he just kind of throws these incredible concepts out there, which I really enjoy, but he rarely answers it. And in this book, he does answer that question, but not in this one. So, eventually, he and his shadow escape to the whirlpool, which is the only place where there's an exit in this town where you can get through the walls. And everybody's afraid of it and thinks that that's where people die. But he's heard rumor that there's caves under there and that it might be an escape. So his shadow's like, all right, let's get back together and jump into this whirlpool together. And he says, no, I'm going to stay here with the librarian. This is where I'm meant to be. You go. Just you go. And his shadow jumps into the whirlpool. And that's the end of part 1. And part 2 is a whole other beast. I'm guessing here because I've never read this original novella from 1980, but I kind of feel like all this middle part is recently written. I don't feel like this is connected to that original novella, but this is just guesswork. This just feels like newer Murakami writing more than the older stuff. I feel like I can hear a difference in the voice. But it's a completely different story, and it jettisons the end of the world concept. It's still there, but we don't see that town anymore. Basically, he wakes up back in the real world, and he has his shadow. He's a complete person, he with his shadow, and he kind of goes on with his life, but he feels awful, and he can remember the time that he lived in the town, and he can remember the librarian and all that kind of stuff, and eventually he kind of has a midlife crisis, and I think he gets up into the early 40s or later 40s and decides that he is done and he wants to quit his job, which he does. And what he really wants to do, he has a dream. He has a dream that's really important. It's a library. He's in a library he's never been in, and he dreams about a hat, like a beret. And he's super confused, and he just decides, you know what? I got to quit my job. I got to find a small town somewhere, and I have to go work in a library. And he does just that. He moves to a mountain town and starts working for a library, which reminded me a ton of Kafka on the Shore. I feel like this is kind of a Kafka on the Shore section of this novel. And like I said, this novel reads to me like it's a greatest hits of Murakami. And we're now on the Kafka on the Shore section, mainly for all the library stuff. There's so much cool library stuff in Kafka on the Shore. So he interviews with this very interesting man. Oh, I got to read something here. I got to remember to look at my notes or I'm going to get confused. First paragraph on page 131 says, this is the link, talking about liminal spaces. This is the link between the shadow jumping in the whirlpool to him being back in the real world. The flow of the river became an elaborate maze, and just as it traveled deep underground, our reality too seemed to proceed inside us, branching out down several paths. Different versions of reality mixed together. Different choices became intertwined, out of which a composite reality, or what we come to understand as reality, took shape. I just thought that was a really cool description of going into a liminal space from one world and coming out in another. Really beautiful writing by Murakami. So his real goal is to find this library that he had in his dream. He quits his job, asks a buddy there, hey, find me a library I can work at. And he's just kind of trusting to chance that he will end up in the library that was in the dream, that's where he's supposed to go. And sure enough, he goes to this small town, interviews at this library with a man named Mr. Koyasu. And Mr. Koyasu is interesting because he wears a skirt all the time, which I thought was really cool. And I don't think Murakami is trying to be woke. I don't think he's talking about gender. He's just talking about the fact that this character feels more comfortable in the type of clothing that is a skirt, and he likes the way it looks on him, and he wears it. Nothing else is. I mean, on the top he wears regular suit and stuff. Just prefers to wear a skirt, and I thought that was really, really cool. It's interesting how intense we get about the culture of clothes and kind of the idea of what gender can wear which clothes. And I just liked that he just had this random character that liked to wear a skirt, and it made him kind of weird in town, but he's a super rich guy, so it doesn't really matter. But he also wears a beret, another weird choice that makes him kind of stick out in town. Basically, this is a very eccentric character, and he is the head of the library, the main librarian, and that's the job that our narrator's taken. But Mr. Koyasu was the head of a family of brewers, and he inherits this brewery and a lot of money, and doesn't really care much for the brewery concept, and donates all of his money to create this library, which is a really big, awesome library for such a small town. So he hires our narrator to be the head librarian and meets with him often and helps him to take on this job and run it right. And slowly, as time goes on, we begin to realize that Mr. Koyasu is probably dead. And there's a part where this is revealed, but I had already kind of guessed it. I think we've been really well trained because of a lot of the horror movie tropes of people being dead, and that's a big twist. So I think we all got trained really good through the 90s and the thousands and the teens to spot that twist coming by little hints that are giving. And Murakami drops a lot of those hints. So he is in this very Kafka on the Shore-esque library, but he is conversing with and learning from a ghost, which brings me to the next novel this is referring back to, and that is Murakami, what Murakami considers his first actual real professional novel, and that is Wild Sheep Chase, which is the second Murakami book I ever read, and one that this channel will cover eventually. Great novel. But in this novel, of course, he meets and speaks with a ghost, and we see that occurring here as well. So here we've got Kafka on the Shore with a little bit of Wild Sheep Chase mixed in. Really awesome. Murakami's mentioned this a couple of times, and I'm going to talk about this a lot when we talk about some of his other novels, but not in this video. But I believe Murakami's preferred way to write is to just start writing and see where the story takes him. And he just tries to have kind of the most interesting thing happen as he goes. I think he's entertaining himself as much as he is us as he's writing, because I don't think he knows exactly what's going to happen. But that doesn't mean that these are unplotted. I'd like to say they're also not meandering, but they do meander. But they are not well, they are unplotted. But what I mean is that doesn't make them weak in plot. Murakami, I think, is actually very strong in plot when you work out. And he always gives you hints of what the endings will mean if the endings are vague, as some of his can be. So this one, a lot of interesting stuff happens, but it's kind of super quick to explain. He meets a kid that has autism, and he doesn't directly call it autism, but I think it is autism. And this kid is a voracious reader. He comes to the library every day and just reads and reads and reads, and is able to memorize. He has like photographic memory of everything he reads. And he also meets a young woman who has seemed to, like him, have run away from something in Hokkaido and opened a coffee shop in this small town. And they have a relationship. And she's another really interesting character, because at first she just kind of seems like, oh yeah, here's a little romantic tryst for the main character to have. But as we learn more about her, she reveals that she is basically kind of asexual. She absolutely does not enjoy having sex, and that whoever's with her kind of has to deal with that. That's just who she is. And our main narrator's able to accept that and continue on kind of having this relationship with her. But once he realizes Mr. Koyasu is dead, he goes to the graveyard often and talks to Mr. Koyasu, because he can't see him all the time, only when the ghost appears to him. So he goes and he talks at Mr. Koyasu's grave, and he tells him all about the time that he spent in the city with its uncertain walls. And the young man with autism, who I don't think they ever give his name, but he always wears a yellow submarine hoodie. So that's kind of how we get to know him, as this boy with the yellow submarine hoodie, overhears all of this. And he's not very communicative, but he wants to communicate with the narrator. So he draws a map of the end of the world, and the narrator helps him fix mistakes of this map. And the young man eventually talks to him and says, I want to go to this place. Oh, Mr. Koyasu has no shadow. That is important. And he says that in the land of the dead there is no shadow, which is kind of a weird hint towards, and this gets kind of convoluted in a weird way. It's a hint towards the idea that the end of the world might be death, but that concept never comes up again, so I don't know if that's true at all. It's just a weird link that furthers the mystery of this town that is never completely explained what it is. Anyway, the young man with the yellow submarine hoodie wants to get to this town. He says, this is where I'm supposed to be. I want to get to this town. And he talks to Mr. Koyasu about it. I think, yeah, they do have a conversation. And Mr. Koyasu says, yeah, maybe he'll do better in that town. And eventually the kid disappears into the town. And, of course, the town's going crazy, wondering where this kid went. They're afraid he walked off and just froze to death. And our narrator's in this crazy position where he feels like the kid probably disappeared to the city with its uncertain walls, but he can't say that to anybody. It would be crazy. As this major portion of the novel wraps up, there's a point where the main character talks about Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and I feel like is really truly a nod by Murakami to Marquez. They're both kind of magical realism writers, and I think that was really awesome. And then we get kind of a final wrap up where he and the woman at the coffee shop make out a little bit. And he says that he can feel what feels like special armor all around her. He explains it like maybe she's wearing some kind of special clothing, but there's this aspect to it that like there's this armor around her that he would never be able to break because it is her kind of personal choice armor. I thought that was really interesting way to describe this connection to someone who I assume is asexual. So he ends up having a dream, and the young man in the yellow submarine hoodie bites his earlobe, and this is after he's gone missing, and that when he wakes up, he really does have a sore earlobe. The whole of part 2 ends with him having a dream about his first girlfriend, and it wraps up everything really interestingly. The wind silently blew over the surface of the river. Her slim fingers seemed to be secretly telling me something vital, something that words couldn't convey. At that time, neither you nor I had names. The radiant feelings of a 17-year-old and a 16-year-old on the grass of a riverbank in the summer twilight were the only things that mattered. Stars would soon be twinkling about us, and they had no names either. She looked right at me, as if peering down at the bottom of a clear, deep spring, with eyes that couldn't be more serious, and then she whispered out a confession, our hands still entwined. Did you know that? The two of us are nothing more than someone else's shadows. And right then I snapped awake, or was yanked back to an unmistakable plateau of reality, her voice still ringing clearly in my ears. Did you know that? The two of us are nothing more than someone else's shadows. And of course that reveals to us that even though he seemed to come back into the world complete, the part of him that was left behind as the dream reader at the end of the world is indeed still there and is indeed the dream reader, and that he is his shadow going to live in the actual reality. And then we get part 3, which is the ending of this novel. So he's going back and forth dream reading. He, of course, never left. His shadow left. And he starts seeing a young man on the bridge staring at him as he's walking around. And he's wearing a yellow submarine hoodie. And that's when we realize, of course, that the young autistic man has made it into the end of the world. And eventually he keeps seeing him, and then he's sleeping and he wakes up and the young man's standing over him. And he says, look, I've come into this world to help you. You and I have to merge, and once we merge, I'll be able to help you do the things that you need to do in this town, and you have to trust me. You have to let me bite your other earlobe. And so we get this connection between the two. Of course, the dream reader there in the end of the world doesn't remember getting bit in the earlobe, although I think he feels pain in his earlobe and there's a wound there. And he says, you got to let me bite the other one, and then we will become one. and we'll be able to really do the work that's necessary for us. I was meant to be here. And so he trusts him, and the kid bites his earlobe, and they merge into one being. Murakami hints at one point. Let me read a quote. He's telling him he absolutely has to be the dream reader, the young man in the yellow submarine shirt. That's right, I have a favor to ask you. I have to become the dream reader. That's the only thing I ask, that I be allowed to read Old Dream. But since I am not a resident of the town, I have no hope of officially taking on that job. So I want to become one with you. If we become one, I can, as you, read old dreams every day. Become one with me? Yes, that's right. It might sound outlandish, but it isn't. In fact, it's only natural. You and I joined together, since I am, from the start, you, and you are, from the start, me. That's on page 421. This was a mystery that I couldn't completely suss out in this novel. I don't know what Murakami is implying about the young man in the yellow submarine hoodie. Are they the same person? I don't know. But either way, they merge. And suddenly, he is like an awesome dream reader. He was worried about doing his job right, and he's really good at it. And he realizes that he has control over their merged conscious all the time, except for when he's dream reading. And when he's dream reading, the young man in the yellow submarine hoodie takes over, and he's able to actually interpret and experience the dreams as they are released. And they get really good at this. And then the young man says, hey, just so you know, I have like a whole library in my head. And Murakami is like obsessed with libraries. And I think it's really cool because I also love libraries. And he talks constantly about having... like moving to take over libraries. And now we have him moving to take over a library in the real world, him working in a library that reads dreams in the end of the world, and now inside his head he's merged with another person who has a library in their head. And of course, he read constantly in the real world, the young man with the yellow submarine hoodie, and memorized all the books. So he's able to spend his time reading from the memory of the yellow submarine kid, all these books that he read. And eventually he's like longing for the real world. And the yellow submarine kid's like, yeah, I kind of knew you would. It's time for you to go. I'll continue reading dreams here, and you go rejoin your shadow. And it ends kind of in a Wizard of Oz way, where it's just like you can leave whenever you are ready to leave, and that's where the novel kind of leaves us. Late that night, Yellow Submarine Boy and I met in that small dark room deep in my unconscious. We sat there, the small desk between us, a thin candle burning as always. For a time we silently gazed at the candle. The flame flickered slightly in time to our silent breathing. So have you given it enough thought? I nodded. You aren't feeling any doubts? I don't think so, I said. I don't think so. The boy said, then at this time I'll say goodbye to you. So I won't be seeing you again? Probably not. We probably will never meet again, but I don't know. Who can say for sure? I took another close look at the boy in his yellow submarine parka. He took off his glasses, lightly pressed down on his eyelids, then put the glasses on again. Every time he put his glasses back on, it seemed to me that he became a slightly different person. In other words, he might be growing moment by moment. I'm very sorry, but I'm unable to feel sadness, he confessed. I was born like this, but if I weren't like this and were a normal person, I'm sure I would feel sad at saying farewell to you. This is merely my imagination, of course, and I have no way of knowing what sadness is. Thank you, I said. I'm just happy you'd say that. Yellow Submarine Boy kept silent for a while and then spoke. I guess we won't be seeing each other again. Perhaps not, I said. Believe in the existence of your other self, Yellow Submarine Boy said. That's my lifeline. That's right, he'll catch you. Believe in that. Believing in your other self is believing in you, yourself. Time for me to go, I said, before the candle burns out. The boy nodded. I breathed in deeply and paused. In those few seconds, All kinds of scenes flashed before me, all the scenes I treasured, among them a scene of a downpour on a broad sea. But I didn't hesitate. I had no hesitation, perhaps. I closed my eyes, focused all the power within me, and in a single breath blew out the candle. Darkness descended, a darkness deeper than anything, a darkness ever so soft. This is a good novel. This is an interesting novel. It's a novel filled with great characters that all really leap off the page. I enjoyed this novel. I know I sound like a broken record, and I keep saying this. I feel like The End of the World is much more fully realized in Hard-Boiled Wonderland and The End of the World, and I think you should absolutely read Murakami's earlier work before you read his later work. And if I would suggest one, I'd start here. It's absolutely an incredible book. But that doesn't take away too much from how enjoyable this novel was for me. In a weird way, for me, because I started Murakami in the late 90s. And throughout all my undergrad, he was my favorite writer. For me, this was like visiting an old friend, because I kind of slowly have moved away from Murakami with his more recent works. Not to say that his more recent works are bad. They're just not what I expect from Murakami. And this was like visiting an old friend. This was awesome because it, like I said, kind of reads like his greatest hits. It's him revisiting concepts and ideas, but doing it in a nostalgic way that's really, really wonderful. And for that, I really enjoyed it. Okay, I have taken down my original Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World deep read. I don't know if anybody noticed, but I did that because I am about to finish up Jay Rubin's translation of it, the most recent translation that was released last month, and I'm going to kind of do a remastered deep dive of that story, talking about both Jay Rubin's and Alfred Birnbaum's translations. It will, of course, have the old video as the core, but I'm going to remaster it, re-edit it, add some stuff. It's going to be cool. All right. Well, thank you very much for sticking to the end of this with me. If you would like to support the channel, please click like, click subscribe, comment. That always helps. If you'd like to go even further, we have a Patreon where I put up other material specific just to Patreon. You can go check that out. It's only $5 a month to join that, and every little bit helps. Thank you again for watching, and we will see you next time.